Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Attachment Network of Manitoba's brand new podcast, Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne. On today's episode, I'm joined by a very special guest,
Marion Willis, and I am the founder and the executive director of St. Boniface Street Links and Morberg House, which is Manitoba's only long-term recovery program for males struggling with meth addiction and an addiction to opioids.
Marion. It is such a joy to have you here today on Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection. A little bit about our podcast quickly before we jump right into it. The purpose of our podcast series is to explore addiction and healing through the lens of trauma and disconnection. As our communities have become more and more disconnected from healthy relationships with family, friends, and community, addictions too have become more widespread in many people's lives. We define trauma for the purposes of our podcast here as the lack of safety, connection, and healthy relationships. The crisis of disconnection is a trauma that we're facing in our communities, in our families, and indeed in our own personal friendships as well. We will be exploring how the trauma of disconnection impacts addictions and people's healing journeys. And we will be asking important questions like how we can connect in ways to assist those individuals, families, and communities that are struggling with addiction. So, Marion, it is actually a joy for us to be reconnecting for the purposes of this podcast. But many of our listeners maybe are just hearing about your good work for the first time. And so let's start at the beginning. From your perspective,
yes,
can you let me know what addiction looks like right here in our province and what's been happening in the last 10 years or so? Are things changing? How do you, tell me, what's the temperature?
Yeah, well, the temperature is 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Addiction in this province, I think, is as serious, okay, as the pandemic is. And when I think about addiction, one of the things I realize is that addiction is not an organic disease that just comes out of nowhere. Okay, this is a challenge, okay, that is an outcome of disconnection at a range of levels. And, I'm a bit of a living historian. For those of you who don't know, I probably should have been retired a few years ago, but I have no plans to do that anytime soon.
So and we're all lucky that you have chosen to stay with us, because I appreciate all your good work, Marion.
So I'm going to take you back a little bit to share something with you that those of you who are much, much younger than I really may not understand this. But, as a bit of a living historian, I can remember the 1970s and the 1980s, okay, when government departments understood the interrelatedness and the interdependence of government departments to work together to support its citizens. Okay, and during those years, government departments engaged in cross-department planning. So, for example, at a ministerial level, at the highest level of government, health, mental health, addictions, child welfare, let's not forget about child welfare, housing, income supports, justice, education, and others, all those programs, they planned those departments planned at the highest levels, and that planning was reflected in their budget statements. And that multi-systemic approach to planning filtered down into a multidisciplinary approach at the service delivery level. And what that meant for people and for families that struggled is that there was a holistic approach. It wasn't just sort of looking at a single issue. It was looking at the individual as a whole and looking at, family life and schools and everything that would impact that individual's life, and connecting to services and connecting to supports and, doing the nurturing to mend fractured relationships and strengthening the connection to families and all of that. And, I have to say, I feel that it was a gift but I also feel haunted by the fact that I've had that experience to work in the 70s and the 80s under that model. It would be in the 1990s when we would see this multi-systemic and multidisciplinary approach basically collapse. And of course, you know, there's a change in government, and it's always politics that drives a lot of things, right? And that holistic approach was replaced by the silos that we've all worked so hard to try to undo today.
So that's the only world I've ever known, is the
I
silo,
know,
the silo business. Because when you were speaking, I'm like, this sounds magical.
it is, Matt, and it works. It's a system that works, okay? Anyway, so the move, okay, away from that multi-systemic, multidisciplinary team approach where everybody worked together, you know, and it didn't matter whether it was an Indigenous organization or a non-Indigenous, it didn't matter who the organization was. We were all on the same team, and we all worked together, and we worked together well with, you know, with everybody. Anyway, the provincial governments, and that would be right across the country, really, you know, decided that that was a very expensive approach, and so that system was dismantled. And it was dismantled without, you know, it's all about saving money. And nobody really considered the social deficit that would replace the fiscal deficit. And I have to tell you that I've watched this and I've been so frustrated as I have actually watched that social deficit blanket, you know, every city, every town, every First Nations community, everywhere right across this country. And today we have what we have. We have, you know, a child welfare system that it really in many ways, you know, doesn't receive the supports, you know, so therefore really doesn't have the capacity to do some of the very critical work that we need to do very early in life to prevent childhood trauma, you know, which becomes complex trauma later in life. You know, I spend a lot of my time these days doing live video interviews with, you know, young people who are in custody, in corrections, right? Everybody looking to get one of those 12 beds at Morberg House. And it is heartbreaking. And I mean, it's heartbreaking. You know, I'm talking to these young people. I'm asking them why they want to come. They want to come because they're so addicted, and they struggle with mental health issues, and they haven't had the supports, and they're the products of a very broken child welfare system, you know, and a very fractured mental health system, and all of these systems that have never been able to work together to really understand, you know, individual, family, and community need. And if you can't understand the need, then you really have no ability to address that need. So, you know, that's what I see. And why Morberg House? Well, because, you know, Morberg House, because I'm that living historian, and because I found that you can't just stand on a soapbox and preach to people. They just don't want to hear it. They tune you out. And besides, I think I'm like I'm foreign to people. I'm like this strange creature who looks through a different lens. So I thought to myself, well, you know what I can do? I will basically create the model. And I don't know how I'm going to make this work in how am I going to create multi-systemic and multidisciplinary in a political and, you know, and service delivery environment that doesn't support that. But you want to know something, Michael? We did it. We did it. And you want to know something? Our recovery rates for those that are struggling with opioid and meth addiction are over 60%. That's many, many times the national recovery rate for addictions. And that is why I like to say we received, I know I received, but I mean, we received the Meritorious Service Medal from the Governor General of Canada just a few months ago. And it actually is because of that. And I have to say that medal belongs to the Brandon University Department of Psychiatric Nursing, you know, and their Winnipeg campus of students that actually agree with me and decided they would work with me, and we would demonstrate that if you can actually build the mental health supports in, right, that they would help us create that multi-systemic, multidisciplinary model, right? The University of
Wow.
Winnipeg Criminal Justice Program that also believes the same and now provides us with practicum students. So we got the justice side in there, right? And social workers and, people involved in education. We have a dedicated EIA worker from the Manitoba, we have a dedicated EIA worker. We
I think it's the Department of Families now where they come
well,
from.
it is the Department of Families now. Everybody, we have a dedicated physician. We have a dedicated psychiatrist. So we've been able to sort of pull this all together, and we're now, just ending our 5th year of service. And so we've had some time now to measure the success of this 2-year seamless recovery model that really focuses on that disconnection and, and the childhood and the complex trauma that results. Okay. And I want to say this, it isn't always about childhood and complex trauma. There's also, mental illness and addiction, is another piece of this. And there isn't always necessarily childhood trauma attached to that. But what this is, it's a system that really says, okay, it's all broken, it's all fragmented. Let's put it all back together and create the model, and let's demonstrate, how we do this. And we're grateful to Tim Fletcher and the REACT program because, we use the REACT program to help all of our participants understand, that linkage between their own childhood and complex trauma. And everybody in the program learns that it is our childhoods that shape us into who we become.
Wow.
And understanding all of that, and looking at that through, the childhood lens, and then at some point being able to take off those childhood glasses and put on these adult glasses now, that have reframed everything,
Marion,
it makes the difference.
so for our listeners maybe who are listening, you may have introduced a term that they're not familiar with of complex trauma. I wonder if you could maybe quickly just explain what is complex trauma as opposed to the trauma everyone else thinks of.
Well, so I'm just going to go back to your childhood, okay? Because I think that a lot of this, evolves out of childhood, whether we stay in our own families, and are living in difficult situations, or whether we're raised in a child welfare system, and that really exacerbates the challenges, right? So, if you're growing up in an environment where you feel unsafe and you begin to experience childhood trauma, okay, it is that traumatized brain, okay, that is beginning to inform everything around you. And as you go through life, you begin to make decisions from a place of trauma because that's what your brain knows, right? And those decisions that you're going to make as you go through life, at 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, and then, into adolescence and your young adult years and all the way through life, if there isn't an intervention, okay, are going to be decisions that are poor decisions and are going to add to your trauma. So now you have layers and layers and layers of trauma, not to mention, okay, that if you add the mental health piece to that, well, and I guess that is what I'm talking about. I'm really saying that your brain becomes influenced, and your ability to make decisions is influenced from a vulnerable brain now that has experienced a lot of trauma. And then you end up with a lot of poor mental health, and all of that together, you end up with a lot of complex trauma because you just keep experiencing over and over and over and adding to it throughout your life until hopefully, a group of professionals can come together to change that. And that's what we've tried to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's helpful. I just want to make sure that we're bringing everybody on the journey here with us.
Yeah.
One of my questions that I need to ask you is about how addiction and people struggle with substances in Manitoba. You've already actually answered the question. I just would like you to expand on it. Okay. Is that its own pandemic? Is that its own epidemic in our community?
It's absolutely an epidemic, absolutely an epidemic. And I remember sort of writing into you in early 2016, I think, when we were all kind of standing on the steps of the ledge and, trying to draw attention to the fact that there was actually an epidemic looming. And at that point, it was the meth crisis. And of course, let's talk about the complexities of that and how, it was a meth crisis and, then the actual pandemic happened, and then that impacted the supply of meth, and that was replaced, by opioids. Not to say that fentanyl and carfentanil and heroin weren't already sort of, in play, but it certainly exacerbated that too. And yes, it's a pandemic. This has been a terrible year for Manitobans. If you look at the number of people who have died, lost their lives to COVID, and then add to that the number of people who have lost their loved ones to drug overdoses, during this pandemic year, it's absolutely horrific. It's absolutely horrific.
Yeah. So speaking of everybody's favorite pandemic, COVID-19 and the services that you provide and people's journey on trying to find healing, how has COVID impacted the disconnection that we've been seeing in our community?
It's added to the disconnection and it's added to the devastation. I mean, let's get real here, okay? The drug epidemic didn't go away because, COVID, the pandemic captured the national airwaves, right? Yeah. Really, COVID provided a veil behind which the drug epidemic really just flourished. And then if you look at how, and again, doesn't this go back to sort of those silos I was talking about, where we're not able to sort of understand, all the feeders and drivers of every epidemic and pandemic, right?
Yep.
And so, now we're moving to planning for, beds and shelters to support people. And we needed to do that, right? But that was, what happened is those beds replaced, for example, beds in detox centers. Do you realize that during this whole pandemic for a whole year, that there have been 7 public beds in detox, 7 for men and 7 for women for the whole city during this past 12 months, only 7. There's actually 17, but 10 of them are restricted use beds to the RAM clinic, to hospitals, to the isolation units. So for any of us, working with individuals or individuals themselves trying to access detox, they haven't been able to do that. 7 beds. And
wow,
it's cost people their lives. It's truly cost people their lives. Because, you have to realize that detox is the emergency room for addictions. And you need to do detox before you can even be considered to go to treatment. So no detox, no treatment.
Wow.
Mental health supports and, all the other organizations, delivering services, had to close their offices and deliver from home. So what was already really quite inadequate in terms of its ability to meet need became even more so. And it really has. It has been absolutely devastating. It's been devastating to families. It's cost people their lives. And, yeah.
How has the pandemic changed the way that you and your team deliver services?
Well, we really stepped it up. What we did was we thought, okay, what are we going to do here? So in Morberg House, we have 12 beds. We're going to actually have to depopulate our house down by 50%. So what will we do? Well, we just partnered with some community property owners that have big houses here in St. Boniface, and we began to lease those houses. We could call Dollard Street here in St. Boniface could be renamed Morberg Way. several big homes there. And we would basically transferred people from Morberg House into these homes. And then we continued to expand on the number of homes that we have and apartments and we took our model into the community. And it was great because, it's all, when you went in Morberg House, we have a very controlled environment. And the real test of our model, okay, would be this multidisciplinary, multi-systemic, long-term seamless recovery model, 2 full years of recovery with supports, right? Could that actually work in a community setting? Well, you want to know something? It has. Our outcomes are no different, okay, than what they were before we started working with people in the community. So the model changed a little bit, where you have a few months in Morberg House and then into the community, just to keep that flow of, keep the opportunity for people to get at Morberg House. So
that's so good.
And there were some good things that came out of it, because we employ a psychiatric nurse. We always have at least 4 psychiatric nursing students with us at all times. We have registered occupational therapists. We have 2 registered social workers, and then a whole team of peer support, which are all the lived experience people that have, and it's a growing number, that have been through our program and come back to help us out. So we began to work remotely. But when I say remotely, it was remotely with the people that were in Morberg House, and then actually doing home visits, actually in the community, making sure, okay, that we were taking all the protocols and so on. And so really, I have to say that services were stepped up. And I think the people in our community program would say they actually kind of got sick of seeing us so often. Whereas prior to the pandemic, they might have said, well, we're kind of neglected out here. We only see you guys like once or twice a week. Well, that certainly changed.
Wow, that's really, I just wanted to give you props for really stepping up to meet the need, because I know that for a lot of people who are out there struggling in their addiction or their mental health journeys, it feels like a lot of services receded when the pandemic came. And so it's just so heartwarming to know that you've been doing this for so many of our relatives out there.
And I have to say, everybody knows that Morberg House is a recovery program for males. But when the pandemic hit, the demand on our services, it came from everywhere. So you'll find that within our community now, we've become a favorite place for people from the LGBTQ spirited community. And we have a small community, cluster community. We also found a way to work with women in the community. Because we could never bring them into Morberg House. Well, I guess we could have, but I don't think I wanted to go there, where you create the co-ed community and recovery. So, we're really serving everybody now. And, and it was just because we, how could you not? How could you not? Yeah.
Wow, that's really encouraging to hear. And I know you've been doling out the gratitude throughout this whole conversation here, and name dropping the people who have been big supporters to you. But I wonder if there's any grassroots organization or anyone in the unsung hero, if you will, that is doing great work that you maybe want to just highlight, that are supporting our relatives on their journeys.
Well, I'm going to, and I have a whole list of them, so I want to talk a little bit about the Sign Foundation.
Sure.
I don't know if you know who the Sign Foundation
is. I love them. They work with a number of groups in the North End as well.
That have made an extraordinary amount of food, and they continue to do it every single day, and they supply every single outreach, team that is working to support our relatives out there that are struggling. So them, the Holy Cross Church, here in St. Boniface, that has made chili every single day, for the full 365 days that we've been in this pandemic. They've made hot chili that we could hand out as a hot meal to everybody that's been living outside east of the Red. An extraordinary undertaking.
That's amazing.
To the Knights of Columbus and Chenu, who allowed us to take over their building to house our outreach team. To I mean, the list is endless. To End Homelessness Winnipeg and to United Way Winnipeg, you know, who were very, you know, even though we're not an End Homelessness Winnipeg supported Housing First organization, they still found a way to flow those emergency funds to us so that we could, you know, deliver an expanded outreach effort this side of the river, helping all of those. You know, why are we talking about outreach? Because that's where those that become so disconnected, you know, and become so sick with addiction end up, right, in encampments under bridges, in bus shelters, and, you know, homeless and without any supports. So there's been a real network of people that have come together, you know,
Wow.
doorways that's really tried to change the way they do things to accommodate. There's just so many, you know.
So I love all of this, and I feel like I already know the answer to this next question I'm going to ask you. But we've come to the part of our conversation together where we dream together.
Uh,
And so, if money wasn't a problem,
yes.
what kind of change would you like to see happen today?
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about two things, okay? Because I first want to go back to where I think addiction is really rooted and where it all starts, okay? I'm going to say to you, okay, that our Indigenous, you know, brothers and sisters, our Indigenous family right across this nation has got to find their way to developing a true Indigenous child welfare system, one that can work and one that is focused on healing. And I just ask you, what do you think it would look like if right across this country, all the Indigenous psychologists and psychiatrists and traditional healers and social workers and nurses and doctors and lawyers, because they're there in throngs now. What if they all got together and they were the ones that decided what the features of Indigenous child welfare would look like? That would be such a great way to do this. The communities would embrace it. There'd be no jurisdictional issues. Families would get the support that they need, the cultural supports they need, because the culture, as you know, is not the same for every Indigenous group across this country. That would truly be Indigenous child welfare. We have not achieved that. We talk about Indigenous child welfare, it doesn't exist. Indigenous child welfare is a national undertaking through the Assembly of Chiefs out of Ottawa, and until that happens, we have a provincial child welfare system with a provincial mandate that simply cannot work. There's been too many children and families that have been lost to this system, and it's time to stop sacrificing Indigenous children and families to the politics of child welfare. You know, get that movement going, okay, that creates national child welfare legislation by Indigenous people. So I would go there. The other thing I'd like to see us do is, you know, let's get rid of the 21 and the 28-day treatment programs. All the money for addiction is flowing across government departments into mental health and addictions to support 21 and 28-day programs in institutions. And I'm going to say that for those who've really struggled with addiction and struggled with childhood trauma and complex trauma, they've had enough of institutions. They don't need any more institutions. We need community-based recovery programs. We're trying to model that. We've shown that those outcomes are real, they're solid. Hey, you know, a Meritorious Service Award from the Chancellery of Honours because the outcomes are so great. You know, let's all embrace this, you know, because that's what we need. We need to see programs like the one that we delivered. We need to see them all over the city. We need to see them, you know, all through the province, and we need to see them replicated right across this country. People need healing and wellness. You know, they don't need to be in an institution, sitting in a classroom, you know, for 21 or 28 days, you know, learning about addiction. They need healing. We don't call ourselves a treatment center because we're not treating anybody. We're supporting people to recover.
Marion, Marion, thank you so much. Wow, you are just such a force. And I really appreciate everything you've done today to help our listeners reframe addiction. Thank you. You are reframing the conversation in such a powerful way, with your example and of course with your message. And so, is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to share with our listeners before we finish?
Well, I say we start a movement. I think there's a whole lot of like-minded people that are watching this podcast. There's like-minded people who are real stakeholders in change. Come on, Michael, let's get the movement going. Let's become the agents of change. Let's just do it.
We don't got to wait for the bad thing to happen. There's enough bad stuff happening in the world. Let's be the good things that are happening in the world. And I think you're right, Marion. We need to create a movement. And anyone listening to this podcast, consider this your invitation, call to action, kick in the butt. We need everyone.
And we're going to do this as all members of one human family. Let's do it.
Marion, you got me all riled up. I'm ready to go. So let's finish this podcast. And thank you so much for being a part of Manitoba Attachment Network's Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection podcast.
And Michael, thank you for your wonderful heart.